And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Welcome, I'm David Kramer with the Aviation Forecast. We'll start off with a look at our flying weather on Thursday. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, widespread IFR conditions are out there, starting to make their way into the west coast as well, especially in the northern portions of Norton Sound and up along the northwest coastline, and then all along the North Slope coastline as well. Out over mainland Alaska, however, we are seeing widespread VFR conditions, looking real nice at the beginning of Thursday here, with some IFR conditions down in the Gulf of Alaska, but clear again as we get over by the Panhandle. As we move into Thursday afternoon, staying VFR out over the Panhandle and continuing to have some IFR conditions out over the Gulf of Alaska, with some of those MVFR conditions extending out into the southeastern portions of the Copper River Basin. Mainland around the states still looking to be VFR for Thursday afternoon, but we are starting to see some of those lower conditions from the Bering Sea starting to encroach upon the west coast in southwest Alaska here, MVFR conditions moving through the Bethel area and IFR conditions along the coastline. Up along the Arctic coast, we're still seeing primarily IFR conditions with more MVFR as we get into the land areas. Then out over the rest of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, widespread IFR conditions are still expected Thursday afternoon. And then moving into Friday morning, continuing to see those widespread IFR conditions extending more into the west coast as we move into Friday morning. MVFR conditions starting to push their way into some of the westernmost locations of the interior, and IFR conditions throughout Norton Sound and up along some of the northwest coast as well. And still seeing those IFR conditions just off the coastline of the Arctic coast. Most of the mainland, however, is still going to see primarily VFR conditions, including the majority of the interior and down through much of the Cook Inlet area. IFR conditions out over the Gulf are extending into Prince William Sound and starting to make their way closer to the Panhandle, but the majority of the Panhandle still expected to be VFR on Friday morning. Then as we move into Friday afternoon, primarily VFR for the Panhandle, but some of those MVFR conditions approaching right to areas farthest to the west of the Panhandle. Then out over the Gulf of Alaska, primarily IFR conditions, making their way into some of the more coastal locations of South Central, some of those MVFR conditions, and eastern portions of the mainland still primarily VFR, but MVFR conditions extending farther to the east throughout Friday afternoon. And along the Arctic coastline, still seeing those worst conditions out over the water. And then all down the west coast, we're seeing MVFR conditions with some areas, the far western points, down to IFR, and then continued IFR throughout the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Taking a look at our passes, up north, Anaktuvik is expected to be VFR throughout the day, as well as at Adigan Pass. Lake Clark and Merrill both expected to be VFR throughout the day on Thursday, as well as Rainy Pass, Windy Pass, and Isabel Pass. Mentasta will start off MVFR and then improve to VFR conditions in the afternoon. Tanita looks to be VFR throughout the day, as well as at Portage. And then Chilkoot and White will both start off MVFR, but pretty quickly turn over to all VFR conditions as we move throughout Thursday morning. Taking a look at our freezing levels, we have a little bit of colder air coming in from the north, freezing levels down to around 8,000 feet there. And then out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian, some of the warmer air coming up with that ridging. And we are going to see freezing levels just south of the Aleutian Islands up to as high as 14,000 feet. Taking a look at our icing, the only main area of icing here is out over a western portion of the mainland above 8,000 feet expected. And then for our flight level winds here, starting at the jet level, we do have westerly flow out of the northern portions of the Bering Sea up to as high as 115 knots. Weaker flow, but still out of the west over the Aleutian Islands up to as high as 65 knots there. Out over the state, we have some flow moving around low pressure up to the north, 75 knots out of a northwesterly direction, just south of the Brooks Range, and then eastern portions of the Brooks Range become southwesterly around 80 knots. Northerly winds moving over south central in the 60 knot range, and pretty light over the Panhandle. As we move down to 9,000 feet, still light over the Panhandle, light over south central and much of the eastern portion of the mainland. Getting up to as high as 30 knots over the southwestern portions of the state out of a westerly direction. But the strongest winds that we're going to see at 9,000 feet are out over the Bering Sea, up to as high as 45 knots over much of the Bering out of a westerly direction. Down to 3,000 feet, our strongest winds are still out over the Bering Sea, northern portions at 35 knots out of the west, and then 35 to 40 knots moving out over the Aleutian Islands and just to the north in the southern portions of the Bering Sea. Along the west coast is where we'll see the strongest winds for the mainland part of the state, out of a westerly direction, 30 knots for southwest Alaska, but pretty light over much of the rest of the mainland and down into the Panhandle as well. As we look at our turbulence, not much over the mainland as we would expect with those lighter winds. Most of it's going to be with our stronger winds out west below 3,000 feet for St. Lawrence Island, and then for the Aleutians getting into the Alaska Peninsula below 3,000 feet out west, below 4,000 feet as we get by the peninsula.